Hello, good morning. We will be starting the 10:15 session. This following session, Melanchthon's Reframing of the Liberal Arts for Lutheran Education, will be presented by Dr. Susan Mobley, who is Professor of History and serves as co-director of the Classical Education Program here at Concordia University, Wisconsin. Please welcome with me, Dr. Mobley.
All right, thank you. I was talking to my colleague, Dr. Manouj, yesterday, and I think we have similar stories about our presentations. I'm on my fifth rewrite. How about you? So I'm not exactly sure how this is going to go because there's so much I want to talk about Philip Melanchthon and the liberal arts that my problem was not what to put in. My problem was what to take out. So with that, let's get started. I want to start with just a brief introduction to Philip Melanchthon. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but there's a couple of things I think it's important for us to know about him. He was something of a child prodigy. He earned the baccalaureate degree at age 12 from the University of Heidelberg, and in fact, he was too young actually to enter the master's program. They told him, no, you can't enter the master's program, you're too young, you're going to have to wait, and he said, fine, I'll go to Tübingen. That's what he did, where he received the Magister of Arts degree at age 15, and then started his academic career teaching. He studied a range of subjects, Greek and Latin works, rhetoric, law, theology, medicine, astronomy, and Hebrew. Perhaps we know him best as Luther's friend, colleague, and collaborator. We also want to remember, however, that his contemporaries gave him the title Praeceptor Germaniae because he was actively engaged in the establishment and reform of schools and universities. He contributed to the development of an educational system in what was then the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. He wrote numerous textbooks, grammars, and handbooks for education. He taught hundreds of students who, as teachers, later implemented educational changes throughout Germany. And his entire career, what he was seeking was to define a theory of education that was based upon scriptural principles. So the problem with Philip Melanchthon is he never wrote a treatise on, here's my vision of education, because that just wasn't something that people did back in his particular era. And so when you want to find out what Melanchthon's theory of education is, you have to read a lot of his stuff, which is problematic because he wrote a lot. He wrote at least 200 orations, thousands of letters, and this is not counting the theological works that he wrote, nor the treatises, nor the textbooks, or the commentaries that he wrote. So piecing together Melanchthon's educational vision, you have to. It's actually very difficult. So what I chose to do, if Philip Melanchthon is an educator, so an educator is concerned with the business of teaching and learning. So perhaps one way of getting at what Melanchthon thought was important in education is to see what he said to the faculty and students at the University of Wittenberg. So I am focusing, most of my information is coming from the orations that were delivered at the University of Wittenberg. There's ordinances of the university, there are programs of study that are issued by the university. So those are the main things that I'm going to be focusing on when I talk about Melanchthon's theory of education. So Melanchthon came to Wittenberg with a fully formed vision of education and a clear idea of his goals as a teacher at the university. While the essential elements of his later educational vision are present in these orations, they will be adapted to circumstances, particularly those during the 1520s. So he delivers two orations that we have, one in 1517, it's his last oration at Tübingen. He delivers one in 1518. This is basically his inaugural oration, and I'm so glad that Dr. Kopf mentioned that, but didn't talk about it, because that's what I'm going to talk about. So, even as a young man, he has a vision of education, but it's going to be impacted by, dealing it's one thing to have a vision of education, it's one thing to get the students to actually do it. There are also all kinds of things happening in the backdrop in the 1520s. The 1520s was a very turbulent decade. And so I think his educational thought that he outlines in 1518 is going to be developing over the 1520s. And by the 1530s, what we can see then is a fully formed vision of education. So this is where I want to start. I want to start with those first two orations and pull out a couple of key things. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so here are 2,000. In this 1517 oration, which is called De Artibus Liberalibus, or on the liberal arts, he is going to present the arts not only as divine gifts, in true humanist fashion, gifts of Zeus, or in the oration he actually uses the Latin name Jupiter, but we start by numbering them 7 according to the 7 strings of the lyre, which was developed by Mercury and then given to Orpheus. And that's what the image on the left is actually a 7-stringed lyre of the kind that the Greeks would have used. But over the course of the oration, he makes the illusion, he uses the illusion that the arts actually don't number 7, they number 9. So those are the 9 muses. So he essentially equates or uses the allegory of the 9 muses to expand the number of arts from 7 to 9, adding poetry and history. Okay, so hold that thought. So in his, and this is an oration, but basically what it is, it's his first lecture. So this is the first lecture that he would be giving at the university as a professor. But because, so you have to kind of understand the context of these two orations. So let me just back up one thing. In 1517, he was completely and totally frustrated with Tübingen. He had tried and tried and tried to get Tübingen to incorporate some of these studies of the Studia Humanitatis, this Renaissance program of education, into the curriculum. They were just old stodgy professors and were not interested in change, and so he finally got fed up, and that's why he took the call to Wittenberg in 1518. But in 1518, we also have to remember that even though he was called as the professor of Greek, he was called by the Elector of Saxony, who didn't actually consult the faculty at Wittenberg on the hire. So Luther himself was a little, I don't know, are you sure you got the right guy? So we have to think about this 15 oration also as kind of an audition. So he already had the part, right? The producer gave him the part, but now he's got to convince the director that he deserves the role. So this is essentially what he's doing in the 1518 oration. He is outlining not only his vision of education, what his vision as himself as an educator are, but he more or less gives a mini history of the liberal arts in this oration. So I want to pull out a couple of key things that he says in this, because I think they're important for understanding his educational vision. So he starts off with the usual rhetorical thing, you know, I'm really not qualified for this job. I'm sitting in here looking at this room full of really smart people. But he says, my duty urged me on so that I may commend good letters and the muses which are reborn to you in the strongest possible terms, for I have taken up their cause. You see how he's picking up that theme from the 1517 oration, talking that the muses have been, are being reborn. And so that's how he's presenting his educational program. So he's going to talk about what happened. Why is it that the muses went away and now that they're being reborn? So he doesn't actually start with the Greeks and the Romans. What I find really interesting about this as a German historian is he situates it in the German context. So one of the things we have to remember is, you know, Melanchthon's a foreigner. He's from the Palatinate. He's not from Saxony. So I think he's also trying to say, hey, look, I'm a German. So he starts with talking about the collapse of the Roman Empire and the confusion that happened in Europe as afterwards with these Germanic peoples. And he says, just as Roman literature was destroyed along with Rome herself, and at once the furor of war destroyed the libraries and killed the muses with inactivity. So that ancient learning of the Greeks and the Romans, poof. Okay. Then we have the big guy, Charlemagne. The Germans would call him Karl der Grosse, or Carolus Magnus, if you want the Latin. So this is what Melanchthon says about Charlemagne. Once he had pacified the boundaries of the Roman Empire, Charlemagne turned his attention to reviving literature. In addition to his already wide knowledge, he applied himself and learned many things which were taught in the schools. He brought Alcuin from England to the Franks, under whose authority the Parisians began to profess letters, certainly with happy auspices, for studies were purer then, and he added moderate skill in Greek matter. So we're seeing a sort of a revival of learning under Charlemagne. And Alcuin really is the spearhead of that. And so what we're going to get during the Carolingian era actually is the formation of the 7 liberal arts, actually into the quadrivium and the trivium. So the quadrivium, the term itself, comes from Boethius. And the picture on the right is a picture of Boethius receiving from philosophy the 7 liberal arts. You'll notice, though, if you take a closer look at that, you may not be able to see it. You can tell from the clothing, Boethius is not dressed like a Roman. So this is probably a late 14th, early 15th century print. And then the 3 guys on the upper left, the 2 guys on the far left, are one of them is Alcuin. The other one is Rabanus Maurus. And Rabanus Maurus is actually going to be the one to use the quadrivium and trivium, and then explain the disciplines in each of those sections. So this is what Melanchthon says about that. Because of that Carolingian Renaissance, that age produced for us Hughes, Richards, and other not very bad writers. Philosophy, not as now, was sought from Aristotle, but verified by mathematics, which all the learned men then had great care for, as is indicated by the ancient libraries of the monks of St. Benedict, of whom there was no one famous who did not bear excellent witness to his learning by a mathematical work. Okay, can you see what he's doing here? Okay, if you don't, I'm going to explain it as we go along. Okay, so the next part of the speech is basically bashing scholasticism, but I want to... I'm going to take a pause from Melanchthon to kind of explain a little bit better what he's talking about. So this is essentially his view of how medieval learning went astray, and this is, at this particular moment in time, it's definitely a humanist perspective on how medieval learning went astray. So this is what happened. We have the recovery of the Aristotelian corpus. So this happens in the 13th century. We get the entire body of Aristotle's works, fresh translations, and this is very exciting for the educational system and thinkers in the West, because it's a rich body of learning to which they had glimpses of it before, but now we have the whole thing. And the thing about Aristotle is he wrote about everything. And everything fits together. So, for example, you can't read his politics without reading his ethics, and then you have to read his physics, and then you have to read his metaphysics to kind of get at what he's talking about. So, this is what was so exciting about Aristotle. He's an entire curriculum. So, what happens as a result of that is we have a sort of reorganization of education, and what happens is theology becomes the queen of sciences. Well, that sounds great, right? Because what we're doing is we're on the pursuit of truth. So here's where the problem comes in. The operating premise of the scholastics is that the scriptures are true. So we don't have to argue about that because we know that they're true. Well, then what do you argue about? So what we have then is the pursuit of truth established by means of logic, meaning the use of human reason. So what eventually happens then is we have the so-called reign of Aristotle, and this is also something that Dr. Koff was talking about in his presentation. So the emphasis is on formal logic, and what we are preparing students to do is to perform well in academic disputations. We are not actually preparing them for life outside of the academy. We're not preparing them for particular careers. We are disciplining, training the mind, but we are focusing almost principally on logic. So there is an allegorical poem about 1250 called The Battle of the Seven Arts, and this is how the poet framed things. Grammar goes to battle with logic, but after a spirited engagement, grammar is defeated, and the muse of poetry goes into hiding. There's that muse again. Okay, so back to Melanchthon. This is what he says then education should be. The youthful studies which they call preliminaries, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, are to be learned to the extent that they instruct one to speak and judge, so that you will not rashly approach the summit of studies. Greek letters are to be joined to Latin, so that you may read philosophers, theologians, historians, orators, poets, and may attain, wherever you turn, the thing itself, and not the shadow of things. So can you see how he's broadening the curriculum? We're putting poetry and history back in. Okay. He says, but choose the best things from the best sources, and with these things pertaining not only to the science of nature, but to the formation of morals. First of all, Greek learning is needed here, which embraces the entire knowledge of nature, so that you are able to speak appropriately and copiously about morals. Morals of Aristotle, the laws of Plato, the poets, and certainly also those who are both the best and can be read in this regard are of the greatest value in order to educate the minds. Now, notice who he singles out here for special attention. Homer is the source of all disciplines for the Greeks. Homer is a poet. Virgil and Horace for the Latins. They're both poets. History is absolutely necessary for this matter, to which, if I dared, I would not be reluctant to contribute to one whatever praise the entire world of arts might earn. And notice that he's putting his money where his mouth is, because this whole oration is basically a historical tour through education with a focus on the liberal arts. So he's drawing upon history as he's constructing his argument. So this is a sort of a closer look then of what the Renaissance humanists saw, and this is a reflection of what we're seeing in Melanchthon's oration right here. So what the humanists wanted is the column on the left. So we want, and I think this is more or less in priority. So grammar and language, history, moral philosophy, rhetoric, dialectic, poetry, music, arithmetic, and geometry. So that is the program of Renaissance humanism. And then that's that medieval program of medieval scholasticism, which Melanchthon spends some time critiquing in this speech. And I kind of tried to, if you notice, it's not an accident that the font sizes are different. I was trying to indicate by size importance. So what jumps out at you here? Logic. Right, and so this was the principle. This is one of the major critiques of the humanists. The other one is that all of these logicians spoke terrible Latin, and nobody else could understand them because they're using this very precise and very technical terminology, and so to them it just sounded like word salad. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you want to know what the Renaissance vision of education was from the Italian perspective, the best place to go is Virgerius. There are two of them, so be careful you get the right one. This is a treatise that he wrote in 1401 called The New Education, where he's outlining this vision of the liberal arts from the humanist perspective. And notice that what the goal of the humanists in these studies is the pursuit and practice of virtue and wisdom. So whereas medieval education really focused on forming the mind, and really was sort of a ivory tower kind of education. What the Renaissance humanists were after was a more practical education, because they're working in Renaissance Italy, which is returning to self-government. So first of all, there is no such thing as Italy until about 1871. You have this collection of things. You have the Republic of Venice, which isn't really a republic, and you have the Duchy of Milan, and you have the Kingdom of Naples, and then you have the Republic of Florence. And so they're returning to models of, so in other words, they're not governed by a bishop or king or lord, so they have to figure out how to do this on their own. And this is why Greek and Roman literature is so attractive to them, because this is exactly how the Greeks and Romans functioned. So this is essentially then what the humanists are after, is a pursuit of practical virtue and wisdom. Okay, so what's missing? So if you are at the University of Wittenberg and you hear this 1518 oration, you're like, well, this is great, but what's missing? I didn't think I'd have to ask a room full of Lutherans this. That's missing, right? We're missing Luther's theology. So, we could spend a whole session just diving into this particular piece, but the reason I chose it is because this is exactly the situation in which the Reformers found themselves. So, notice that this is, well, if those of you can read the German at the top, this is a woodcut about the true and false religion. Can you tell me which side is the true religion? On the left, right? As soon as you see Martin Luther, you're like, oh yeah, that's the true, okay? So the false is the Catholic, it's on the other side. Now, why is it important that this is visual? Not everybody could read. So one of our principal concerns as reformers is making sure that people understand the principles of the faith. So it's one thing to have this at the university level where you have a bunch of academics going to lectures, being intellectually sociable, that sort of thing. But then you have to take that outside of the university context and you have to bring it to the people. So, that's going to be the main job of pastors and teachers, but we also have a lot of other people who are going to be expected to be leaders in their communities. And so the education provided at Wittenberg isn't just for teachers or pastors, it's basically for all of the people who are going to be leaders in the community. So this is essentially then what we're going to see happening. So again, Dr. Kopf mentioned this a little bit in his talk. So the major shift when Luther began to reform theology is we toss out all those scholastic commentaries, all the theological handbooks from the Middle Ages go out the door. We replace it with scripture, apostolic writings of the church fathers, but we want students to be able to read those in the original languages. So that's going to mean Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So when Luther makes this change, he starts really in 1518. He's looking at his lecture hall. Guess what the students don't know? Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, right? Their Latin actually isn't very good either, because remember, the humanism is just now coming in. So a lot of students coming up to university still, their grasp of Latin is a little... So this is what Melanchthon, that's his project. So in the 1520s, he has to figure out how to reform the curriculum to support the work of Luther's theology, but with this larger goal in mind. And I'm going to come back to that larger goal in just a second. So what we see then is Melanchthon's framing of the liberal arts. So what he does first is he has to emphasize a correct order of studies. What was happening is, and again, Dr. Kopp mentioned this too, but all the students were flooding into Luther's theological lectures, but he's lecturing on Scripture, and he wants to lecture from the text in the original language. They can't understand him. And there's a lot of stuff that is going on in those theological lectures that the students just aren't equipped. So we want to make sure that students are prepared for those higher studies. And as a humanist, he's going to emphasize the artis dicendi, so the arts of speaking. And that's really more than grammar, logic, rhetoric. He's also going to poetry and history are also important in that. And he's also going to then organize students into classes. So, grouping them by skill and knowledge levels. So that to make sure that their learning is happening sequentially and that they're not passed from one level to the next before they're ready. So it's a more individualized approach to education. So what he's actually doing here is he's reviving an ancient order, and he says this over and over and over again in his various orations. He's like, look, this is not new. This is not new. What we're doing is we took a wrong turn in the Middle Ages, and what we're doing is we're going back to that point before we took the wrong turn. I'm paraphrasing. That's not what he says, but I'm paraphrasing. So what we want is grammar with Latin authors. We want grammar with Greek authors. That's where we start. But he's going to expand the liberal arts, as I mentioned, to history and poetry. So what you see up here is probably one of the most famous images of the medieval liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium. And what I find kind of funny about this is you see the guys that are outside the circle. The two on the left are poets. And the two on the right are called mages. So what Melanchthon wants to do is he wants to put the poets inside the circle, and let's turn those mages into historians, and we want to put them inside the circle. So that everything is inside the circle, but that everything connects. And philosophy is still in the center, but he's going to sort of make some adjustments to the position of philosophy as well. So this is his reframing of the liberal arts. He, in several of his orations, calls it a chorus of the arts. Sometimes he talks about it in terms of the orbis artium, and an orb is a ball. It's a sphere. So he sees all the arts as connected, and this is what he says. There is a close relationship between the arts. Therefore, even if some of them appear to excel and to be preeminent in life, they nevertheless stand in need of the resources of the others. The various arts are associated and yet separated. And for those who feel that the lower disciplines are useless for life because their benefit is not so visible, disturb this chorus of the arts. In other words, in order to get the whole symphony, the whole harmony of the arts, you have to study them all. So, what's the Reformation connection? I think the best place to see that in a nutshell is in an oration from 1531. This was, Melanchthon wrote the oration, but he didn't deliver it. Caspar Kuckeger was one of his friends, delivered it. And he said this, "And you ought to keep in view the purpose of your studies and decide that they are provided for giving of advice for the state, for the teaching in the churches, and for upholding the doctrine of religion. You will not be able to excel in any of those without perfect doctrine. And perfect doctrine is not granted to anyone without the lower disciplines." And he's talking there about the arts. That preparatory training in the arts is essential for studying of theology. To teach religion effectively, one must have a thorough education in the arts. To administer the state effectively, one must have a solid grounding in the arts. And to be of service to neighbor and to community, one must be able to act with discernment, which is honed by the study of the arts. So, as I was working through this presentation, in round 5, I'm like, oh, how about this? So, I'm going to present, so I'm sort of interpreting Melanchthon here, but I think he sees the arts as foundational. He sees the arts as practical. He sees the arts as formational. And he sees the arts as evangelical. So I'm going to walk through each of those. So the arts as foundational means that they prepare students to do other things. So in an oration on arithmetic, he says, "It is most true that once one knows arithmetic, the other arts can be understood more easily. For arithmetic is among the first arts, which teaches us to distinguish and divide between one and many. It shows the order of things and teaches us that confused things need to be unraveled and distinguished. These are the beginnings of reasoning." So arithmetic is just about numbers. It's about ordered thought. And then he goes on in the same oration to say, this is the reason why the ancient Greeks, too, taught arithmetic second after grammar. Then in the third place, they ranked dialectics, and in the fourth, geometry. For they saw that dialectic takes its beginnings from arithmetic, and the practice of multiplication and division prepare the intellect for syllogisms in an excellent way. In the same way, the power of demonstration can be better understood once one knows arithmetic, because it has extraordinarily distinct demonstrations. And so if you were at Nathaniel Hahn's presentation yesterday, he was talking about going back to some of the Greek authors on math because of the way in which they approach the study of numbers. And Dr. Veith was in the crowd and made an astute comment that this is actually like putting all the arts together. I mean, it's like language, and it's like, and I'm like, yes, that's exactly what Melanchthon said, right? So can you see that he's not separating the trivium and the quadrivium? He's saying that they interlock. Okay, hold that thought. But the arts are practical, right? Here's utilitarian argument. For only he can have the right feelings about the arts, who, when he has noticed their order, understands that each art has been devised because of its certain usefulness. Therefore, our ancestors, when they established the sequence of learning, thought out certain steps like grades, by which the young would be led in order from the lower arts to the higher ones. Now, as if these restraints had been broken, the matter is done without order, suddenly like mushrooms. Theologians, lawyers, doctors are brought forth without dialectics, without knowledge of speaking, without the cradle bands of natural and moral philosophy. So that's the practical part, right? It prepares you for these higher studies in a very practical way, but they're also useful for daily life. The benefit of geometry, too, is manifold, not only in building and in measuring vessels, but also to a statesman for cosmography, for understanding the distance between places. So in other words, the liberal arts, when we study them all together, are practical not only in academic terms, they're practical in daily life. The arts as formational. So what Melanchthon was really seeking to develop in students, I'm going to use the English word, discernment, the ability to judge. Let me just read what he says. This is, again, from an oration from 1523. Chiefly, however, students will give effort to learn to speak correctly. How much importance this thing has is able to be assessed from the writings of the greatest authors of the past. When the method of speaking correctly was neglected, it befalls that they also judge imprudently in human affairs. Erudition that includes not only the knowledge of words, but also some variety of things, is a great ornament for the church. For it is neither possible to form a judgment without consideration and comparison of many things, nor does one's oration have vigor or strength if it does not arise from good things. So what he wants students to be able to discern is what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. And they can't do that if they haven't studied a lot of things. But the arts are also evangelical. Therefore, each one must aspire to a perfect knowledge of sacred discourse, both for his own salvation and for the common good of the church. Knowledge of languages is necessary for explaining the Holy Scriptures. God himself judges this to be so, who, by giving us the gift of languages with the gospel, proves that the knowledge of languages is necessary. In an oration from 1536 on philosophy, he says, "Indeed, foremost in the catastrophe of evils is an unlearned theology. For it is a miscellaneous teaching, in which important things are not explained clearly, that which should be separate are mixed together, and those things which nature postulates should be joined are pulled apart. Often contradictory things are said, and things that are similar are seized in preference to things that are true and proper." So not only is this a problem for someone delivering a sermon who doesn't thoroughly understand what it is he's talking about, but this is also a problem in witnessing. Now, for Melanchthon in the 1520s, a lot of his thought was really impacted by some of the turbulent events of the 1520s. We have the German Peasants' Revolt And if you look at the 12 articles produced by the peasants, there are a lot of sort of Luther's ideas cropping up in those articles. We have what the Germans call the Schwärmerei. Those are those radicals who are using Scripture, right? So this is one of the things that concerns Melanchthon, that we can't just give students the Bibles and say, read this. We have to guide that reading. And so this is why education is important, not just for pastors and teachers, but for all Christians. Indeed, so that's how he sees then the arts as evangelical. So his vision of education then is, sometimes he is seen as an academic. He's more comfortable in the halls of academia. But I think that he also has an understanding of the real world and some of the challenges that his students are going to face once they leave his classroom. So for Melanchthon, the arts are essential for church, state, and Christian life. And this is what he says. The church has need of liberal learning, and not only the knowledge of grammar, but also knowledge of many arts and philosophy. The merit and power of the arts themselves are able to be seen in no greater way than this, when we see how much need there is for them in the church, with how much darkness ignorance obscures religion, what fearful destruction of churches, and how much barbarity and confusion of all humanity it brings about. So, in other words, his students have a higher responsibility, even if they're not going to be pastors, even if they're not going to be teachers. They have a responsibility to live peaceful, godly lives in service to neighbor, but part of that is protection, preservation of the gospel. So he says, then it should sharpen and arouse care for learning, because your studies pertain to the church and to the state, nor should so much private utility and pleasure be sought from them. So, in other words, it's while he is interested in the development of individual students and developing to their capacities, the ultimate end of that is for the common good. Most of what I told you, he's talking in a academic audience, so he's talking to the university students, faculty. But in 1528, there is a round of visitations. This is after Frederick the Wise died. We had the German Peasants' Revolt. We have a new elector. He said, guys, maybe we should go out and see how things are going out in the parishes. You go out there, ask a few questions and give me a report. So that happened in 1527, 1528. And what came out was actually fairly disturbing. And so Luther and Melanchthon are going to collaborate on a set of instructions for pastors. So this is presupposing parishes which don't have a lot of resources to offer, a lot of education. So we're focusing here on what is the most important for students to know. He says Latin grammar. And you start at the beginning, letters, spelling, vocabulary, syntax, and then you read authors like Cicero and Virgil. Read poetry, Ovid, Virgil, literature like Terence and Plautus, music, but notice here we're focusing on music within the context of the church, liturgy, hymns, and then also moral instruction. So the moral instruction is going to come obviously from the scriptures and from the catechism, but we're also interested in things like Aesop's fables, the colloquies of Erasmus, and Dr. Kopp's favorite book, Cicero's De Officiis. So we're also going to be taught scriptures and Christian doctrine, Psalms, Gospels, letters of Paul, and then the fundamentals, Lord's Prayer, the Creed, 10 Commandments. And then those who demonstrate ability, once they master this, can go on to study dialectic and rhetoric. So basically what these instructions are in 1528 is kind of like, okay, this is the minimum. It's kind of given them a framework as they're developing schools in these different areas of Saxony. So let me just close with, I think, a summary statement then on Melanchthon's vision for Lutheran education. Therefore, the schools belong to the ministry of the gospel, or if you will, they are an essential part of that most sacred office, for it is necessary first that those to whom the leadership of the church is to be entrusted be trained long and diligently. The ministry of the gospel must be kept and protected with equal care both in the church, both in the schools and in the church. In other words, he saw the work of the schools and the church as inseparable. They are working together to preserve and to spread the gospel. So that is his overriding concern for education. Thank you for your attention. I think we have time for questions. Oh yeah, but that's a critique. He's critiquing that totally. He's saying that without the proper order of studies, this is what happens. If we let students say, "Hey, I want to be a lawyer. I don't really want to do this whole liberal arts thing. Can I just start studying law?" That's what he's talking about. He says, and that's why he uses the term mushrooming. It's a negative connotation. He says, "This is the problem that we have. This is the problem we need to fix. Here's my solution." Yeah. And, all of these are in translation. Sometimes you have to read them in the original to get the effect of what he's saying. Oh, yeah, totally. Yes. Yeah. It's the same thing that Luther talked about in, I think it's the letter to Councilman, the one from 1524. He talks about how parents are equally at fault in this because they just want to send their kids to professional schools so they can get good jobs and promote the family fortunes. And Luther and Melanchthon are like, "Oh, okay, fine. It's okay if you want to be a lawyer, but you got to do this stuff first." Okay, so the Reformation started at Wittenberg. And so the university, Reformation starts at Wittenberg. Luther is already changing the curriculum for theology in 1518. Frederick, there's a reason why Frederick, they call him the wise, because he is like, okay, we need to slow down. And so it actually took a while for a lot of these reforms that I just talked about to get into the curriculum, because one of it was Frederick was like, I'm not so sure about this. Okay, that'd be a whole nother conversation. There's, okay. I'm trying to think of a summary. This is why I went through 5 versions of this, because this was in one of my previous versions. Okay, so when we think about the university, we have to understand that in the origins of the university in the 13th century, it's a clerical institution. It receives students from all over Europe, and its authority to grant degrees have to rely upon a universal authority, and for most of the Middle Ages, we only had 2, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor. So when Wittenberg wants to go Lutheran, remember, Luther did not like the Pope. Did anyone, kind of catch that? Yeah. All of a sudden, there's one of the universal authorities gone. How are our degrees at the University of Wittenberg going to be valid? Well, also remember who's the emperor at the time. It's Charles V. Charles V is not a big Luther fan. So on what basis then can the university award degrees? So some of these reforms take a look. In fact, there's a period of several years where they can't award theology degrees at the University of Wittenberg because they can't figure out on whose authority. That relates to our chapel message this morning. On whose authority is the university granting degrees? So the short answer, that was not a really short answer, but the short answer to your question is yes, the University of Wittenberg went Lutheran. It is the model for all of the other Protestant universities in Europe. Calvin is doing his own thing, largely in Geneva. And for most of the 16th century, they do not have a foothold in universities. Heidelberg is going to shift over to Calvinism at some point later in the 16th century, and then shifts back to Lutheran, and it goes okay, it's a big mess. But primarily, all of the religious groups, Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, maybe not the Anabaptists, are developing their own systems of education. Does that answer your question? Okay. Oh gosh, there's two hands. I saw yours first. No, I'm definitely not going to make a judgment. However, I'm being recorded, so no, I'm not going to make a judgment. I will say this. I'm actually currently involved in a research project on Concordia history. We're actually looking at both Ann Arbor and Mequon, and my task in this has been to study what we call the core curriculum, which is essentially a liberal arts curriculum. Well, if you look at how they perceived liberal arts, starting in the 1960s, they are actually perceiving it in the way that Melanchthon did. Not the trivium and the quadrivium, you do these verbal things first and then you do the mathematical things. I mean, they're actually seeing this more organically. So I think that, most Lutherans, if they're actually doing Lutheran education, like it was envisioned in the 16th century, are actually doing classical education. So I think to some degree we are doing it. We've just forgotten that's what we're doing. Does that answer your question? Well, I'm telling you what, we in the School of Arts and Sciences are fighting that battle, right? Right, Dr. Manoj? I mean, we're really trying to preserve that liberal arts. And I was just talking to Dr. Haley before, and this is one of my pet peeves is that when we get students as freshmen, all the functionaries are going to tell them to pick a major. I'm like, why? They're 18. Give them some time, right? And that's really what the liberal arts is for. It's foundational. It's practical. It's formational. It's evangelical. We need to give students time to sort of absorb that. So higher education could be doing a better job at that. I think that Lutheran education is doing a better job than the larger landscape, but I think we're less intentional. And I think we could be more intentional about it. And there was another hand over here. Well, he's definitely trying to pull the moral element out of history. And, this is why Melanchthon eventually goes back. None of the disciplines in the liberal arts actually have a methodology in the period that we're talking. They have a way of approaching things, but there's not a specific methodology. So history as an academic discipline did not exist in a formal way until the 19th century. And then it comes in at the same time as the rise of modern science, and then we try to make it a science. But as I talk to my students all the time, is history an art or a science? So Melanchthon is, this is why he goes back to Aristotle, because he is drawing upon the methodology of Aristotle, not so much the content of Aristotle's like philosophy. I don't know, does that answer your question? Well, he writes orations about, the church fathers. He writes on Plato, on Aristotle, on, I didn't find one on Charlemagne, but on I think it's one of the Fredericks, one of the emperors. History in the Reformation era tends to be very polemical. They use history to kind of, push an agenda. But if we go back to the Renaissance and we look at, I just blanked on his name, History of Italy. It'll come back to me. We're actually seeing among humanists this idea about developing a national history. So he writes a history of Italy, and I know that there's a lot of work currently looking at Latin culture in the 16th and 17th centuries. A lot of the work is focusing on like Scandinavia, and what we're seeing there is the idea of all these different peoples developing their own national history, which is part of an identity. And that's why I find in that 15 or 18 oration, Melanchthon actually using history to talk about the liberal arts and to talk about education and rooting it in a German context. He's basically telling his audience, look, this isn't an Italian thing. We were onto this first. We just forgot. So I think he is using it as a tool, not only for moral, but also I think for positioning individuals within their historical moment. Does that make sense? Yeah. I don't know that he actually teaches any classes on historical authors. So, that's the other thing that in the modern era, this is really, really hard for us to understand, particularly us academics, because each history, philosophy, biology, they all have, they're very discrete. They all have their own methodology. They have their own objectives, and it's kind of like we built silos, right? And this is an era before we have that. So we're teaching sort of a body of knowledge, but often we do it on the basis of an author. So if we want to study moral philosophy, we'll study Cicero, right? Rather than we're studying moral philosophy, it's more like we're studying Cicero's De Officiis, and we're going to talk about moral precepts kind of thing. So it's a little like apples and oranges maybe a little bit when we try to sort out, well, how is this a discipline, right? I hope I answered your question. Okay. There's a hand somewhere. Oh. Yeah, and again, it's this idea that, in the Middle Ages, they weren't studying these things to actually apply them in their lives. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of the students at these universities were members of the clergy, and a lot of them were monastic orders. And so the ethos came from that, not necessarily from the education. And now what we're having to do in the Reformation is we're having to develop an ethos for being a Lutheran. What does it mean to be a Lutheran, no matter what your calling is? And so there's that kind of a shift. It's a transition. So that's why, when we talk about Melanchthon's vision of education, while he does have a vision of education, there is some some transition periods because he's kind of working through some of these problems. Yeah. Yeah, and as much as Melanchthon read the Romans, he's a Greekophile. He loves the Greeks, and he's trying to get everybody to read as many Greeks as possible. If any of you are going to Lutheranism in the Classics in the fall, I'm going to be talking about what he says about Hesiod, because he has some really interesting things to say about Hesiod. That's a really good question. And to my knowledge, and I did work through all like 76 of the orations that he wrote for Wittenberg. To my knowledge, he didn't write something specifically on music. He did write on astronomy and astrology, but not on music. But I would say two things that may or may not address what you're saying. So the oration that I referenced on arithmetic from 1536. Melanchthon wrote it, but he didn't deliver it. The man who actually delivered that oration was the guy who convinced Copernicus to publish his treatise. And then the second thing I would say is that at a few decades down the road at the University of Tübingen, which was influenced by Melanchthon's ideas, comes Kepler. And Kepler talks about the harmony of the spheres. So he's talking about astronomy, but he's using sort of musical imagery, the harmony, to get at that. So we could presuppose that there's something in Kepler's Lutheran education that led him to that. Well, that's where the great what's the word I'm looking for? That's where the great energy is in astronomy, and it starts with Copernicus, and then we have people like Galileo, and we have Kepler, and that's kind of the sort of harbinger of the scientific revolution. I know when I talk about the scientific revolution in my class, I talk about astronomy because it's the easiest thing to present as sort of a transitional, right? The scientific revolution is a huge change in the way in which people in the West thought about science. I don't know, did that answer your question? Yeah, and I think too, the other thing with music, and you musicians in the room know this, music is always last on the list, right? Yeah, we got 20 minutes on Friday, let's just have some music. So I think that, when we're talking about developing education in this very tumultuous moment in time, they have to prioritize, and so I think that's why they prioritize the hymns, the liturgy. If we have to choose what is the most important for students to learn, and it's that. I'm sorry, what? Oh, go back to the previous slide. That one? Okay. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? The best place to... this is another problem with Melanchthon. He wrote a ton. Most of it's not been translated. So you can find, for those of you Latin scholars in the room, the Corpus Reformatorum is now digitized. Woo! So you no longer have to go to Germany or some really big library to find it. You can find it online. If you want some help finding his orations, let me know and I can give you the link. There are two books that I could recommend. One is extremely hard to find. It's by Ralph Keane. It's called A Melanchthon Reader. It was published in the late 80s. If you live or have access to a major university library, you might be able to find a copy of that book. He's got several of Melanchthon's things translated. More recently, there's a book edited by Sachiko Kusakawa on Melanchthon's orations on philosophy and education or something like that. It was published in the late 90s. The translator is actually Christine Salazar, but the editor is Kusakawa. Kusakawa also, if you're interested in, I didn't even talk about philosophy, but she really made a landmark argument in, I think, 1995, 4, somewhere in there, about Melanchthon developing a particular Lutheran reading of natural philosophy. So the transformation of natural philosophy is a book that she wrote. There is actually a lot of Melanchthon historiography. There's a renewed interest in Melanchthon's thought. Most of it, unfortunately, is in German. So there's a couple of things in English. Timothy Wingert has worked on Melanchthon. Robert Kolb has done some work on Melanchthon in English. But a lot of the stuff is accessible in German. All the more reason to learn German. Yeah, and in that the Kusakawa book that I just mentioned, she has several of his orations translated, and she kind of does them topically. It's not chronological. It's by topic. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll hang around up here if people have questions. Thank you.